It is a great pleasure for me to be here. I don't feel a stranger, although this is my first time at the University of Maastricht. Turns out that Joritz and I go back, should I tell them the number of years? It's a lot of years, but yeah, most of you are not born yet, he wants to tell you. But 1970, in fact, his oldest child was just an infant at the time that we met when he was a visitor at the University of California at Berkeley. So we've gone back together a long time, and I've also had close relations with actually quite a few faculty here. So I feel that not only coming to this beautiful city, town, very comfortable, but I also feel that I've had a relationship for a long time with the university. Indeed, perhaps even almost from the beginning, because 35 years, we go back 40 years. So thank you so much for inviting me here, and I appreciate it very much. Now, I'm not an expert on problem-based learning, but I know a little bit about it because 20 years ago, I was trained to do problem-based learning and then taught a course for a number of years with the administration program of Ed Bridges, who has worked with Vim here. So there are a lot of interlocking directorates and things of that sort here. And what I wanted to do is, I changed the title a little bit, and you're going to notice something on here. The title is The Glacial Pace of Educational Change. And if you look down at the date, you'll notice how frustrated I am, because what I've tried to do is to speed up this glacial pace of educational change by bringing us to tomorrow instead of today, okay? Yes, good. Well, let me begin by just stating that I had a colleague at Stanford named Larry Cuban. Name may be familiar with some of you, an educational historian. And Cuban decided that he was going to write a book on the entire 20th century in terms of what happened in education. And he went and he obtained from many of the depositories and libraries in the country very crisp descriptions of what education was like over the century. Descriptions by teachers, descriptions by journalists, descriptions by students, of course, and I'm very happy that we have our students here today who are going to respond to all of this. And what he did is he cobbled together a history of what the educational experience was like, what were instructional strategies like, what kinds of materials were used, what were the underlying assumptions, psychological assumptions of learning. And he came to the remarkable conclusion that had a Martian visited the US, let's say in 1915, and looked at what education was and written it up, and had a Martian come in, let's say, 1995 and done the same thing, they would have plagiarized each other. They would have written the same description of the system. That is, despite almost a maddening pace of innovations that had occurred over this entire century, there was something strange going on, which is that the educational process looked quite the same at the end of the century as at the beginning. Now, there were differences. You didn't see computers in the classroom in 1915, but these were really decorations more than anything else. That is, the fundamentals had not changed. And to some degree, he asked what was happening here. And so I start off by saying that when we read work on education, we hear about the imperatives for change all the time. We read about the needs for change. We read that education's changing, and we hear about the revolutions. And what are these? Well, some of them are the use of new technologies. We just heard about e-learning. Of course, educational technologies have been around for a long time. Even if we move away from the chalkboard, we had slides, we had educational radio, we had movies, films used in education, we had educational TV, We had all sorts of use of video cassettes and things like this for education. Then, of course, eventually computers and the internet. So this has been going on for a long time. We have new demographies. Certainly, the Netherlands is very aware of the challenges of its new demographies. We're told that we have a need for problem solvers and entrepreneurs, and we're really working on it, turning these people out, risk takers, thinkers, and so on. And probably there's more basis for that in problem-based learning than any other form that we have. And we also face inexorably rising costs. This is a particular phenomenon that economists have looked at, because the argument is that since we do things, it confirms what Cuban found. Since we do things in the same way, we simply import the costs of sectors that are doing things in different ways, raising productivity, but by raising productivity, we raise the costs of those inputs. They get paid according to their productivity. We import that into the educational sector, and so we see rising costs without end, inexorable, as they say. And we don't know what to do about it. That is, education looks much more like the string quartet than a production activity. Well, what do I mean by the string quartet? Well, obviously the salaries and costs of artists is rising, and the cost of the string quartets to those who are producing their work is rising, and the ticket prices are rising. And so what do? Do we substitute one of these artificial music machines for one of them? Do we get a string trio instead of a string quartet? The answer is no, because there's something about a string quartet and the music that has been written for a string quartet that can't be modified where we get the same experience. And for some reason, that seems to underlie what we do in education, despite what appear to be the accoutrements of change. I want to emphasize that this is not a failure of effort, that I'm not saying that we are lazy, that we are stupid, or anything of that sort. There are all kinds of innovations out there. E-learning, of course, is certainly one of them. In the US, we have charter schools and choice, which one could argue simply follows what the Netherlands have been doing for the last 100 years in terms of trying to get freedom of choice. We have internationally 50 countries that have gone from providing poverty transfers, that is support to families, without requiring anything of them other than that they take the money and spend it, into a new system called cash contingency transfers that require the families to make sure that their children are in school, to make sure that they use the health services, to make sure that they use nutritional additions to the diets and so on as a condition of receiving these grants. And there have been very good evaluations of these. And what do we find? Well, we find that there isn't much change. That's what we find. So this leads us, you'll notice I'm trying to stay on pace here because I've been given 20 minutes, okay? And that's good, because 25 minutes would bore you. If I finish in 20 minutes, there will be a few people in the back in the cheap seats who will be sleeping, but most of you will still be awake. Okay, so what are the obstacles to change? Now, these are hypotheses. I'm not going to tell you that any one of them supports the explanation. I'm not even going to tell you that they're mutually exclusive. Depending upon how they're defined, they may overlap. But one assumption is that the knowledge base on organizational change is incomplete. We're missing some key elements. Certainly in the last 20 years, there's been concern that we put too much on theory and too little on implementation, or what we do with implementation, organizational development, is very idiosyncratic, doesn't work in many situations, can only work in unique situations. So when we go to scale, it doesn't happen, but we can always point out a few instances where it does happen, and we generalize from that, and that's wrong. Second possibility is the knowledge based on leadership, also inadequate. We don't fully understand what it takes in terms of selecting, training, evaluating leaders. I happen to like problem-based learning, so I'm not going to lean very heavily on that. Here's one that people don't usually talk about, and that's education as a conserving force. We talk about education as if it's there to change the world. We have all of these challenges. We've got to change things. We all agree on that, do we? The fact of the matter is that historically, education, and particularly education that's been obligatory, has been there to reproduce society, to reproduce our values, our institutions, our ways of relating to each other. In other words, education, the way we've set it up, is necessarily a conserving force. I'm going to use conserving rather than conservative. It's a conserving force. It's here. We want our children in Holland, a small country, small group of people who speak the Dutch language, to speak Dutch. That's a conserving force. We could say, well, you know, the world is going towards this lingua franca, which doesn't make any sense, called English, and it doesn't make any sense, but that's the way it is. Let's just move, right? We're going to change. We're just going to work in English from now on. Why this confusion? And the answer is because we value our history, we value our society, we value our culture, and we are going to reproduce that culture. Now, language, of course, is an easy example, but the fact of the matter is there are many obvious and many subtle aspects of our societies, and it's very important that we reproduce them. I want to tell you I have a Dutch daughter-in-law, and she is teaching Maximilian Jacob Levin Dutch. So he will be someone in the diaspora who will be speaking Dutch, and she is conserving the Dutch culture in her child, okay? So, although we use the rhetoric of change and how we have to use education to change, the fact of the matter is that those people who are engaged in education are behaving in a way that they've learned about education, which is it is a conserving force, and that's not to be put down. That's a very valuable part of education. The way we interact together, the way we work together, the way we understand our institutions, our history. Although I know in modern Europe and America, there isn't a lot of history taught anymore, at least the history that many of us learned. But even so, there are elements of history that come through as we are taught. School culture, which is related to this, that school culture this is the way we've always done things. That's what makes them valuable. Whether that does make them valuable or not is another matter. But anyone who has worked with schools in this room knows it's very difficult to get serious change over any long period of time. And even when we get minor changes, it's very difficult to bring it up to scale. And then there's the new institutional theory. This is an overarching picture which argues that reproduction is inevitable simply because schools depend upon other institutions from which they get their resources, their ideas, their approval, their legitimacy, and those are institutions that are not pushing for change. Those are institutions that are pushing to sustain their own relationships in society. So I generate these as hypotheses, each one which has some plausibility. They are interrelated, they're not mutually exclusive, but they're ways of thinking the opposite of change. That is, trying to explain why is it that we haven't seen change, even when we have a strong group of people who have a belief, who work together, who have good ideas, and so on. So this gets us to at least one perspective, which is what we call turning points in history. If we go back certainly 150, 160 years, 200 years, we do see changes in education. Particularly in the 19th century, we did see big changes in education. Just the movement towards so-called compulsory schooling, obligatory education, a structure of education being built, and so on. And what happened here? Well, I had another colleague, an historian. I've learned more from my colleagues and students than I have from any formal degree program. So I'm happy to accept, of course, the honorary doctorate, but not as a recognition of university learning in the traditional sense, as a recognition of how valuable my colleagues and students have been in terms of educating me. And one of my colleagues, a man named David Tyack, who is also an eminent historian, said, let's look at certain key points in education when there was change. And most of these are 19th or early 20th century, just at the point where Cuban starts to do his work and where he would argue that things settled down. And what he argues is that these were turning points in history. They went much farther than education, and that education responded to them, as opposed to education creating these kinds of changes. And he called these social movements. He also wrote a book which documented this. Now, what are these social movements? I mean, there are a lot of different definitions of social movements, different understanding, but basically groups that did not work together and that had structurally different ways of looking at the world and needs suddenly found that within education and within a particular direction of education, they could have their concerns satisfied. And by coincidence, you get a confluence of groups who normally do not work with each other, do not form coalitions, and they come together supporting changes in education. He argues at that point, you start to see changes in education and fairly large changes in education. And I've listed a number of these: business, government, educators, citizen movements. And that it's only when you get this kind of social movement do you get real change in education. Perhaps this is something that will happen around the immigrant movements into industrialized countries, and particularly into Europe, into the US, where it's going to affect seriously all of these particular groups. But there's a puzzle here, and that is social movements. We don't know a lot about social movements, and I'm going to finish with a very short story. It's January, it's a cold month in the States, cold month here, and two men who are old friends meet on the beaches of Miami. And one says to the other, "What are you doing here? This is your busiest season." And he says, "Whoa, you didn't hear." He said, "We had a terrible fire in our business. And the insurance company paid $500,000. And so I thought I'd take a vacation before beginning to build my business again." And then he said, "But you're in the same business. What are you doing here? This is your busy season too." And the second man said, "Oh, you didn't hear? We had a flood, a terrible flood." Maybe, this gets a little close to reality here in the south of Holland with the Maastricht River. But in any event, he said, "We had a terrible flood, and it destroyed our business. And we got $5 million of insurance money, so I decided I would take a vacation before we start up again." And the first man looked at the second man and said, "Tell me, how do you start a flood?" That's the question. How do we start a social movement? How do we foment a social movement? Thank you very, very much.